Let's get some analysis now with Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large at The Australian. Paul, where are things at in these talks with the Nationals?
I think the parameters of the deal are starting to become clear, provided, of course, the National Party comes on board. And those parameters essentially are net zero at 2050 and a cautious approach in the medium-term target at 2030. So there's no more ambitious target. There's just an update on where we are, which will take those targets from 26 to 28 to the low 30s. Now, if you look at the politics of this, I think the politics are that Scott Morrison is saying the focus on net zero at 2050 is the government demonstrating that it's coming on board for serious climate change action. So the message to Australian voters who want action on climate change is the government has met the 2050 target. The message, the political message in terms of 2030 is a message to the regions. And the message here is that the government is not going to sacrifice traditional jobs, traditional industry, traditional emissions-intensive jobs and industry recklessly, that they will look after these jobs and these industries in the near term. So that's a message to the region, and it's a message of reassurance to people. So one of the fundamental questions then is there are two different political messages. How does one reconcile them? How does one reconcile the 2050 targets with the 2030 targets?
Now, common sense would suggest the Nats would, the majority would see the political ramifications of them not acceding to the Prime Minister's broader plan here. But often over the last decade or more, Paul, common sense hasn't always prevailed in this Parliament. Well,
you're right on that. And we're all assuming that common sense will prevail and there will be a majority in the National Party room to sign up to the broad parameters, and the key parameter, of course, being net zero at 2050. Now, the point to make about Scott Morrison here is that he's increasingly presenting this whole package as an economic package. He's increasingly presenting it as this is an economic structural change to the global economy. It's a change that Australia has got to meet. Australia's got to get on board. And essentially what he's saying is that you can bank on the coalition to best handle this sort of economic transition in its two dimensions. One dimension being the clean energy dimension and seizing the opportunities from the clean energy revolution on the one hand, and the second dimension, of course, is not sacrificing traditional jobs in the near term on the other. Now, of course, the climate change lobby and many people will say there's a massive contradiction here, but that's how Scott Morrison intends to present it. And I think at the end of the day, the National Party has got no real viable political option but to come on board.
And Paul, what's at stake here? What's at stake here for Labor in terms of its response to whatever is landed by the federal government? Anthony Albanese's obviously got to come up with some midterm plan to satisfy many within his rank and file and within his parliamentary party. But I guess the balance is not to go too far to make themselves a target once again of an easy hit by the government.
Well, if you look at it from Labor's point of view, so Labor's already committed to net zero at 2050. So we're going to have a bipartisan position on 2050. Now, I think this is pretty significant to begin with. We haven't been there before. Now, the second issue, of course, is where does Labor come up in terms of the medium-term targets at 2030? And I think it's fairly obvious that Labor must have a more ambitious target than the government when it comes to 2030. But Labor's got plenty of scope here, essentially because the debate has changed, because the Business Council is now committed to a medium-term target of 46 to 50. So this gives Labor plenty of scope to have a target in the medium term, which is below what business and finance are calling for, but which is above what the government is calling for. Now, Scott Morrison will probably attempt to wage a scare campaign against Labor in terms of that 2030 target, but the currency to run that scare campaign is increasingly diminishing, given that the whole debate's changing. What Scott Morrison will do is he will say that he's got a better economic plan than Labor.
Paul Kelly, I appreciate it as always.